She said to me, "I insist that you talk to me as if I were a human being." And I could not help answering, "Madam, I am not acquainted with this person whom you call a human being." God, I just love that quote. And you're gonna see how brilliantly that quote ties into this video. So let's start off by looking at the definition of democracy. Oh my god, he's looking at the dictionary definition of something! He must be doing exactly what the feminists do when they point people to the dictionary definition of feminism! No, that's not what I'm doing. Just save your reactions for after the video. Just pretend for a moment, I know you don't believe it, but pretend for a moment that you don't know absolutely everything. So now that I've addressed the peanut gallery, let's go back to what I was in the middle of. So, democracy. Let's look at the dictionary definition of democracy. It is defined as a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. Okay, that's cool. That's not really important. That's not what we're actually going to look at. We're actually going to go down and look at the root of democracy. Okay, so it's made up of two Greek root words, demos and kratia. So, demoskratia. Maybe I'm saying that with a little bit too much of an accent. But anyway, so demoskratia. So it stands for the people and power and rule. So, you know, the people rule. So that's what it stands for. And a common trope or common slogan of democracy is that democracy is of the people, by the people, for the people. So, long story short, my name is Buck, and I'm here to Sorry about that, folks. There seemed to have been some kind of mishap in the video stream there. So let's get back to the criticism about democracy. My central criticism of democracy is around this idea of the people. I believe that the people is ambiguous beyond all meaning. The people is a concept that has no place in a political discussion. It really is analogous to saying that the forest rules. The forest is made up of a lot of different complex organisms, different kinds of trees, and different kinds of critters. The forest is a concept that is used to conveniently summarize all of the complex organisms that make up that locality. And the people is the same exact thing. It's a concept that we use to conveniently summarize a group of individuals. And these concepts, they're created for the convenience of discussion. But not any discussion. These concepts only exist for casual discussion, and they have no place in political discussion, because political discussion is a type of philosophical discussion, and philosophy is a type of science, and that is why it is known as political science. And in science, everything needs to be clearly defined. So now let us clearly define the people. So as I've already said, the people is a concept that we use to conveniently group together a group of individuals in a certain locality. So that means the only thing that the people have in common is their locality. And when we further analyze the people, like any proper philosopher should do, we find that the people, as I've already said, is made up of individuals. And we find out when we further analyze the people that some of these individuals are the same as other individuals, and some of them are remarkably different compared to other individuals. That is, we find out that the people consist of minority and majority groups. And it's important to emphasize groups. There isn't just a minority group and a majority group. No, it's more complex than that. There are minority groups, majority groups, minority groups, and so on and so forth. It's a lot more complicated than the word the people makes it out to appear. And because not all of the groups which make up this the people are granted ruling power, because only the groups that can secure a majority of votes during election time are granted the power to rule, because of those two things, we can say that this collective known as the people is actually never ruling. It isn't the people that are ruling, it is factions within the people that are ruling. It is the mob that is ruling, or the masses, or the majority, whichever one of those words you'd like to use. But the point is that it is not the people that are ruling. And I'm sticking specifically to the people ruling and not the people participating. You cannot get confused by that. You cannot say, oh, well, democracy is when all of the people have a chance to participate in government. No, that is not the meaning of democracy. Once again, when we look at the definition of democracy, it is the people and ruling, or the people, and power. And if you don't want me to use the definition of democracy, then I'll try to make up a reasonable definition of government that can help us clarify this. So we can look at government as the people who have the ruling power. And because voting or participating in this way doesn't give you any actual ruling power, then you cannot be said to have any ruling power. And if you don't have any ruling power, then you can't say that you're part of the government. Or to put differently, there is a difference between voting power and ruling power. And I think that when you confuse voting power for ruling power, all kinds of bad shit happens. You excuse the tyranny that the ruling power has on the voting power that did not vote for it. You make it as if the 40% being ruled is no different than the 60% ruling it. And this idea of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, comes into being. Now, other people might also convince you, and convince themselves, that a liberal democracy is of the people, by the people, for the people, because the ruling power in a liberal democracy is constrained by ideas of individual liberty. Liberties that are common to everyone who makes up the people. However, these people confuse it just like the people who confuse voting power for ruling power. Liberties are a type of power, and liberties are supposed to protect against ruling power. However, we see many cases where ruling power supersedes the power of individual liberties. And if you don't believe me, and if you want an example of that, you need not look any further than the Patriot Act. Real liberty consists in being able to liberate yourselves from the mandate of the people, of being able to liberate yourself from the collective, and to be able to freely associate with whatever collective you want to. All of those other liberties are great, they're really wonderful, I'm all for them, but without the liberty to freely associate, without the liberty to declare your independence, all of those other liberties are mere optical illusions to convince you that you have liberty, to convince you that you have ruling power over your own destiny. So by now, I'm pretty confident that I've successfully argued that democracy is not a state in which the people have power, like all of the people have power, but is rather a state when certain factions within the people have power. And that means that the definition for democracy is terribly wrong, and I mean like Orwellian newspeak kind of wrong. And because of that, I believe that I have a right and a philosophical duty to correct the definition of democracy. And for those of you who haven't seen my video on the correct meaning for the word correct, I know there's a double use of correct there, it sounds a little funny. But anyway, the proper meaning of correct, or to correct something, means to erect the core of that something. It means to bring out the core of that something, its principal elements. That's what lies at its core. So, as I've mentioned already in this video, the core of democracy is this idea of the people. So that's exactly the part of the definition of democracy that I'm going to address. And I'm going to do this by reevaluating the root word that is attributed to the prefix of democracy. That is, I'm going to reevaluate the root word attributed to demo. Demo, the prefix to democracy, is currently attributed to the word demos, which in Greek means the people. But I've already gone through how this doesn't make any sense, how this is ambiguous beyond all meaning. So what I've done is I've looked for a word that better reflects the reality of democracies, that better reflects the actions of democracies, because after all, actions are the real truths, and as Ortega said, an idea is putting a truth in checkmate. And that is precisely what I hope my definition of democracy does. I hope that it puts the truth of democracy in checkmate. I hope that it portrays the truth of democracy in such a way that that truth cannot be brought to any other level, cannot be misinterpreted in any other way. To make the word democracy a word that sophists cannot abuse. Or to put it another way, and a way that I actually really like, to make the word democracy foolproof. So that the word democracy is safe in the hands of the oh-so-foolish masses. And here it is, the foolproof definition for democracy, explained in a way that any fool can understand. Demo does not come from the Greek word demos, which means the people. Demo comes simply from the word demo, as in to demonstrate. For some of you, that will instantly make total and complete sense. But for those of you who need me to further elaborate, allow me to do so. So just the word demo, the first meaning of it, is a demonstration of a product or technique. Well, a democracy is demonstrating who has the power, the ruling power. That's what they're demonstrating. And the root meaning of the word demonstrate is to prove or establish. Or when broken down, de means entirely, and monstre means to point out. So it could also be to entirely point out or show, to entirely show or to entirely point out. So a democracy is actually a government that is constantly demonstrating or constantly proving its ruling power. And this would actually be really awesome if periodically the government had to demonstrate why it was worthy of being your government. And if it had to do this logically or philosophically, like if it had to logically prove itself, and this is how it should be, that if that government failed to prove itself, if it failed to logically demonstrate why it's worthy of being your government, not the government of the people, that doesn't exist, but why it's worthy of being your government, you as an individual, and it should be that if it failed to do that, you should be able to dismiss it. And although to some of you it might appear like this is what we have, some of you might say, oh, well, this is what we have. If you don't like the government, you can dismiss it by voting for representatives who are against the government. To those people, I say you do not understand the nature of people, you do not understand the nature of government, and most importantly, you don't understand the nature of our current democracy, which I would like to call Democratia de es Popular. Or in English, power and rule demonstrated entirely through the popular. See, our current government is not like the awesome government that I just suggested before in a couple of ways. First of all, it does not prove itself in a logical, philosophical way. It proves itself using the popularity fallacy. Secondly, when people vote in democracies, let's say a democracy like America, they're not voting for or against the ruling power. They're voting for or against representatives. They're voting for someone who will use the ruling power in a way that represents them. And the ruling power is the US Constitution, or the federal government. Sure, our representatives have power, but they do not have ruling power. And this is important to understand. And this is why when I say our government or the government, you cannot think about this in a superficial way. You have to understand what the government really is, what the ruling power really is. And the ruling power is the Constitution. And when you vote for a representative, you're not voting for or against the Constitution, especially since the government that the Constitution creates is also made up of unelected officials. And actually, it's the most powerful branch of our government that is made up of unelected officials. And that branch is, of course, the judicial branch. We don't vote for judges. Judges are appointed, and federal judges are appointed for life, so they are not beholden to the people that appoint them. They are only beholden to the Constitution. Their purpose is to make sure that the legislative and the executive do not deviate from the Constitution. And that is precisely why the Supreme Court has deemed it unconstitutional to declare your independence from the federal government or from the Constitution. And that's precisely why the Supreme Court allowed Abraham Lincoln to go to war with the states that had seceded from the Union, despite the fact that the country's founding document gave them the right to declare their independence. And that's also exactly why I believe that the current government is not legitimate, because it is in violation of the country's founding document, the Declaration of Independence. And it's not even a secret anymore, okay? It's not a secret that the Constitution is in direct violation of the Declaration of Independence, because the Supreme Court, who deems what is constitutional and what isn't constitutional, has deemed it unconstitutional to exercise the right that the founding document gives us. So don't fool yourself into thinking that when you go and you vote for your little representatives, your senators and your congressmen and your executive president, don't fool yourself into believing that when you vote for these people, you're voting for or against the ruling power. for or against the status quo. It wasn't that a brilliant thing. Oh yeah, they're voting against the status quo. That's why they're voting for Trump. No, no, no. The ruling power, the status quo, is the Constitution. And these representatives that you're voting for, they're nothing more than two sides of the same coin. And that coin is the Constitution, the tyrannical federal government. And that's exactly what we're going to take a quick look at now, since the Constitution starts off with the same ambiguous word of "we the people." I'm going to start off by saying, and I should have said this earlier in the video, that the people, used in this political sense, used in this terminology, used in this context, is a fiction. It's a fiction that requires people to believe in it. And that is exactly why the entire Constitution is a fiction. It has no basis in actual empirical reality, like the Declaration of Independence does. And please, like many of the things that I asked you not to confuse in this video, you must not confuse the Constitution with the Bill of Rights. They are not the same thing. Despite what they teach you, they are not the same thing. You can say, the Bill of Rights was amended to the Constitution. That doesn't mean dick, okay? And you can prove this very easily, very empirically. The Constitution has been used to usurp the powers of the Bill of Rights on many occasions. If the Bill of Rights was really a part of the Constitution, if it really had the same amount of ruling power as the Constitution, then that wouldn't be possible. But I digress, and now I'm going to quickly discuss why the Constitution, the United States Constitution, starts off with this fiction of "we the people." And I'm going to start off this quick discussion about "we the people" in the United States Constitution by quoting a couple of Anti-Federalists. And for those of you who don't know, the Anti-Federalists are the founding fathers who spoke against the ratifying and drafting of the United States Constitution. And this quote comes from Patrick Henry, and he said, "I rose yesterday to ask a question which arose in my own mind. When I asked that question, I thought the meaning of my interrogation was obvious. The fate of this question and America depend on this. Have they said, 'we the states'? Have they made a proposal of a compact between states? If they had, this would be a confederation. It is otherwise most clearly a consolidated government. The question turns, sir, on that poor little thing, the expression, 'we the people,' instead of the states of America. I need not take much pains to show that the principles of this system are extremely pernicious, impolitic, and dangerous. Is this a monarch like England? A compact between prince and people, with checks on the former to secure the liberty of the latter? Is this a confederation like Holland, an association of a number of independent states, each of which retain its individual sovereignty? Had these principles been adhered to, we should not have been brought to this alarming transition from a confederacy to a consolidated government. We have no detail of those great considerations which, in my opinion, ought to have abounded before we should recur to a government of this kind. Here is a revolution as radical as that which separated us from Great Britain. It is as radical if in this transition our rights and privileges are endangered and the sovereignty of the states be relinquished. And cannot we plainly see that this is actually the case? The rights of conscience, trial by jury, liberty of the press, all your immunities and franchises, all pretensions to human rights and privileges are rendered insecure, if not lost, by this change so loudly talked of by some and inconsiderately by others. Is this tame relinquishment of rights worthy of free men? Is it worthy of that manly fortitude that ought to characterize republicans? It is said that 8 states have adopted this plan. I declare that if 12 states and a half had adopted it, I would with manly firmness, and in spite of any erring world, reject it. You are not to inquire how your trade may be increased, nor how you are to become a great and powerful people, but how your liberties can be secured, for liberty ought to be the direct end of your government." The next quote comes from an Anti-Federalist that did not wish to use his real name, so he used a pen name which was Brutus. And he said, quote, "If it be further considered that this Constitution, if it is ratified, will not be a compact entered into by the states in their corporate capacities, but an agreement of the people of the United States as one great body politic, no doubt can remain, but that the great end of the Constitution, if it is to be collected from the preamble, in which its end is declared, is to constitute a government which is to extend to every case for which any government is instituted, whether external or internal. The courts, therefore, will establish this as a principle in expounding the Constitution, and will give every part of it such an explanation as will give latitude to every department under it, to take cognizance of every matter, not only that affects the general and national concerns of the Union, but also of such as relate to the administration of private justice, and to regulate the internal and local affairs of the different parts. So both Brutus and Patrick Henry realized that the statement, "we the people," was a statement that was declaring that this constitution, that the government this constitution was creating, would be a government that would extend it to every single person. A government that would usurp the power of the individual states and the individuals who make up those individual states. This statement in the Constitution is asserting that it has jurisdiction over all of the people because it is asserting that it was established by all of the people. But it wasn't established by all of the people. The people in this context is a fiction. And the people who wrote the people there are clearly arrogant, narcissistic social justice warriors who believe they have the right to speak for all of the people. But they don't. If they were elected democratically, you can say that they have a right to speak for the mob, and that's a much more clear thing, the majority, but they do not have a right to speak for the people. And actually, just a little historical note, these assholes didn't even have a right to speak for the people who elected them. They didn't even have a right to make this document for the mob that had elected them. Because they were elected, this Continental Convention in which the Constitution was drafted at, this Continental Convention was meant to improve upon the current government, not to establish a brand new government. But I've sort of digressed, and I do that. I kind of have these long explanations, or I take the very long way to getting to my point. And my point was this. It is that the people was put into the preamble of the Constitution, or the Constitution starts off with the people, to make the Constitution seem more justified. Just like the people has been put into the definition of democracy, the people power, it was put into the definition of democracy to make democracies seem like a more justified version of government. In other words, the Constitution starts off with "we the people" to set you up. It's to set you up to think that this Constitution is a just Constitution. To make it appear like the government this Constitution is creating isn't a centralized tyranny. It makes it appear like it's decentralized amongst all of the people. And that way, all of the tyrannical actions of this Constitution can be seen like the actions of "we the people." It's not that this government is a tyranny, it's us doing it. It's essentially hiding the tyranny of this government behind the people. It's sophistry. It's psychological sophistry. Anyway, I can say a lot more on the subject, and I will say a lot more on the subject in other videos. And I'm going to conclude this video now with the rest of Brutus's 12th essay, because I want you to hear what he had to say about the rest of the prelude of the US Constitution. Such a rule of exposition is not only consistent with the general spirit of the preamble, but it will stand confirmed by considering more minutely the different clauses of it. The first object declared to be in view is to form a perfect union. It is to be observed it is not a union of states or bodies corporate. Had this been the case, the existence of the state governments might have been secured. But it is a union of the people of the United States considered as one body, who are to ratify this Constitution, if it is adopted. Now, to make a union of this kind perfect, it is necessary to abolish all inferior governments, and to give the general one complete legislative, executive, and judicial powers to every purpose. The courts, therefore, will establish it as a rule in explaining the Constitution, to give it such a construction as will best tend to perfect the Union, or take from the state government every power of either making or executing laws. The second object is, quote, to establish justice. This must include not only the idea of instituting the rule of justice, or of making laws which shall be the measure or rule of right, but also of providing for the application of this rule, or of administrating justice under it. And under this, the courts will in their decisions extend the power of the government to all cases they possibly can, or otherwise they will be restricted in doing what appears to be the intent of the Constitution they should do, to wit, pass laws and provide for the execution of them, for the general distribution of justice between man and man. Another end declared is, quote, to ensure domestic tranquility. This comprehends a provision against all private breaches of the peace, as well as against all public commotions or general insurrection. And to attain the object of this clause fully, the government must exercise the power of passing laws on these subjects as well as of appointing magistrates with authority to execute them. And the courts will adopt these ideas in their expositions. I might proceed to the other clauses in the preamble, and it would appear by a consideration of all of them separately, as it does by taking them together, that if the spirit of this system is to be known from its declared end and design in the preamble, its spirit is to subvert and abolish all the powers of the state government, and to embrace every object to which any government extends. As it sets out in the preamble with this declared intention, so it proceeds in the different parts with the same idea. Any person who will pursue the 8th section with attention, in which most of the powers are enumerated, will perceive that they either expressly or by implication extend to almost everything about which any legislative power can be employed. But if this equitable mode of construction is applied to this part of the Constitution, nothing can stand before it. This will certainly give the first clause in that article a construction which I confess I think the most natural and grammatical one, to authorize the Congress to do anything which in their judgment will tend to provide for the general welfare, and this amounts to the same thing as general and unlimited powers of legislation in all cases. Another great end of this Constitution is, quote, to establish justice. This supposes that this cannot be done under the existing governments of the states. And there is certainly as good reason why individuals living in the same state should have justice as those who live in different states. Moreover, the Constitution expressly declares that, quote, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. It will therefore be no fiction for a citizen of one state to set forth in a suit that he is a citizen of another, for he that is entitled to all the privileges and immunities of a country is a citizen of that country, and in truth, the citizen of one state will, under this Constitution, be a citizen of every state.